Napoleon Bonaparte, an astrological portrait by Ciro Discepolo. Although I am of Jungian extraction, I believe that three major psychological thinkers have made absolutely unique and original contributions to this discipline, which scientists refuse to call a science like astrology. They are Sigmund Freud, Carl Gustav Jung, and Alfred Adler. I don't often recommend depth analysis to those who consult me for several reasons. First, because I believe not everyone needs it. Second, because I believe a particular sensitivity and culture are required to undergo psychoanalytic treatment. And finally, because I believe the choice of approach to the analysis itself should be carefully considered. In other words, although I am a Jungian, I would never dream of recommending such a focused depth analysis to someone with, for example, strong Taurus, Scorpio, or second, eighth house values. In this case, I would have no hesitation in recommending Freudian psychoanalysis. If, however, I find strong Capricorn values in the birth chart I'm examining, I would opt for an Adlerian analysis because I believe no one has better pinpointed Capricornian issues with the strong feelings of inferiority associated with them than Alfred Adler, who in his nervous temperament spoke of fantasies of power and the highly ambitious and megalomaniacal attitudes that derive from them. Often this is linked to a rather short stature, which contributes to increasing the feelings of inferiority already described. This is the case for many people with the moon in Capricorn in their horoscope, like Napoleon Bonaparte. And there are even those who have theorized, and they are not just any fool, the superiority of short-limbed people over taller ones. Undoubtedly, physical appearance can play a decisive role in the destiny of a man who, for example, as in the case of the great Corsican emperor, endured the humiliations of his mediocre stature and his island origins throughout his childhood. These factors, sometimes combined with other elements of destiny, produce exceptional results in the success of a man who directs all his energies toward the conquest of material power that indisputably establishes his superiority. Of course, being short and bulky isn't enough to secure a lifelong career as a leader, as in the case of Amintore Fanfani. Other essential factors detectable in the birth chart and the historical, political, geographical, and economic conditions of the year and place of birth are also crucial. In the case of Napoleon Bonaparte, we have a Leo-Scorpio ascendant structure that speaks volumes. Napoleon bore the hallmarks of a commander, a dictator, and a fanatic. The Mars-Neptune conjunction we cannot tire of repeating leads to fanatical visions, which drive the ego toward exaggerations and hypertrophies that, in the right environmental conditions, produce the desired results. In the case of the Emperor of the French, he found himself commanding artillery battalions during times of revolt, and there he was able to express all the aggressive and dominant energy he possessed. Then there is the element of luck. No one can aspire to high positions of command or fame without the generous support of a Jupiter or even a solar dominant. In this regard, I've been observing Jupiter's position on the border between the first and second natal houses for a long time, and I've noticed that in many cases it corresponds to positions of fortune that aren't entirely clear, since we would see the star much more powerful in the upper angle of the rising between the 12th and first houses. But so it is. Pay attention. Look at many charts of lucky people and notice how strong this position is. On the other hand, anyone who thinks they've discovered everything in astrology is simply presumptuous and would do well to study the art of uranium many more hours a day. Regarding the dominant of Napoleon's chart, however, I think there can be no doubt whatsoever. Mercury. He certainly expressed, alongside the connotations of greatness and great strategist, also those of Pierino, who on more than one occasion used deception, lies, and trickery to overcome the obstacles he faced. Indeed, he often disobeyed orders from France, and on several occasions, especially during the successful Italian campaign, he disobeyed the central power to act like a petty dictator and act with complete freedom. The position of Saturn in the ninth house deserves some separate consideration. This astrological significance, I'm sure, would be indicated by the vast majority of astrologers if asked where they would place their natal Saturn. In other words, I believe that if you asked 1,000 astrologers where to place their natal Saturn, at least 999 would answer in the ninth house. In fact, in my opinion, that's where it can cause the least harm, provided one stays at home and doesn't wander the world. I believe in the idea of exercising symbols, or if you will, the ritualization of symbols. Saturn in the ninth house is a symbol and should be read as such, but as great thinkers like Carl Gustav Jung taught us, symbols are not abstract figures, but also represent the living realities of our existence. The ideal would be, for example, to have Saturn in the ninth house, to dream your whole life of moving abroad and never actually go. This way, you would unload the great evil of tradition and suffer the least possible harm. Otherwise, the damage can be quite severe, and in the case of Bonaparte, we read, in the final balance of his life, a disastrous Russian campaign, the island of Elba, Waterloo, and St. Helena. In everyday life, for ordinary people, for the likes of Rossi and Esposito, this doesn't happen, but in their own small way, we still read of small Waterloos that can be avoided if the symbols are read and interpreted correctly. Those who are always busy giving us lessons in wisdom will tell us that the same position can also mean something else, and not necessarily negatively. To these we reply that everyone is free to choose the life they want, and if they wish to experience the extent to which Saturn in the ninth house can be harmful or beneficial, they need only choose the combinations this star suggests when it is in the zone of the sky following the 2 hours of its culmination. One might object to this argument that for Napoleon, foreign countries were not only ruin and destruction, but also splendor and victories. True, but in the end, which of the two counted, which were decisive for his destiny? Uranus in the seventh house, even if I have been accused of being very deterministic and of having been rather drastic in this description in my guide to astrology, does not contradict itself here either, and I have rarely had occasion to interpret this position otherwise. As is well known, Napoleon Bonaparte divorced Josephine Beauharnais in 1810, who had previously secured his command of the army for the Italian campaign, and married Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, with whom he had his son Napoleon II the following year. Here, too, we find a classic meaning in traditional astrology, a significant love, at least one that was foreign, or at least distant, Venus in the ninth house. But we know that the French dictator often expressed his libido, even of an erotic sexual nature, in numerous love affairs that accompanied the brief nights in which he allowed himself very little entertainment. He worked non-stop day and night, and made sure to be present at the drafting of civil and military codes, and to pay close attention to the smallest details. He often replaced his officers, preferring young men, from whom he demanded absolute obedience, over old comrades in arms who were more inclined to take liberties with him. The uniqueness of studying a biography lies, first and foremost, in observing the transits that echoed the magical and disastrous moments in a character's life. There are still some astrologers who consider planetary transits to be simple symbols of the unfolding of our endopsychic experiences, but if we look at the facts, that is, the concrete things in our lives, marriages, promotions, successes, bereavements, misfortunes, catastrophes, we find precisely the transit that echo these situations, and denying them is equivalent to affirming anything. Let's look at some for our own. On May 18th, 1804, he was proclaimed Emperor of the French, and for that date we find two transits that seem quite emblematic of the situation. Jupiter conjunct the ascendant at just 2 degrees and Saturn trine the moon in the same orb. For the following year, on May 26, 1805, the subject was proclaimed King of Italy in Milan Cathedral, and here too we find some textbook transits. Jupiter trine the midheaven, Neptune trine Saturn in an orb of 0 degrees, and Pluto perfectly sextile itself. For the 2 years just examined, we find the 3 primary directions. Sun 60 degrees Saturn, April 30th, 1804, Ascendant 120 degrees Saturn, September 10th, 1804, and midheaven 120 degrees Pluto, September 8th, 1805. Then there are the dissonant ones, like the tragic Waterloo on June 18th, 1815, with Saturn opposite the midheaven and Uranus perfectly square the midheaven. But where we'd like to focus our attention is the solar return of 1812, the one related to the great defeat of the Russian campaign. Let's try to draw two, one for Ajaccio, his birthplace, and the other for Moscow, where Napoleon actually was at the time of that fateful return. As can easily be seen, the second is decidedly more tragic than the first and evokes strong eighth house values, which explain the hundreds of thousands of deaths that war caused and the enormous economic damage it also caused. I'd like to take this opportunity to clarify my views on the place for which the solar return should be domiciled at the time of one's birthday. This choice, which is part of traditional astrology and has been emphasized by Volguine over the past 30 years, and modestly by me in recent years, with the publication of my text, Guide to Transits and Solar Returns, has recently been challenged by some authors. To these authors I reply that astrology theorizes that the solar return is a snapshot of the sky at the moment of a birthday, and it's therefore unclear why one should domify for Abbiategrasso, simply because John was born there 40 years earlier, even if he was in Shanghai at the time. The second author, Volguine and Barbol, who were the first to address this topic, at least in this century, clearly stated that one should domify for the place where one happens to be on one's birthday, even though these same colleagues never sent anyone to perform a targeted birthday. Last but not least, experience must be considered. I don't think the colleagues who challenged me on this approach have any experience in the matter. Personally, over many years of study, in addition to having studied many thousands of solar returns, I have studied hundreds of targeted ones. That is, those of people who went to a specific location on Earth on my advice, and after a year discussed the results of this experience with me. In any case, everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but they should at least justify them and not simply say they think that way for no reason. Ciro Discepolo, many years ago,